Today's video takes us to the Milwaukee Region, Wisconsin, USA, where a very well-known serial killer with a Netflix documentary based on his life was born. We are talking about none other than Jeffrey Dahmer, the man accused of murdering 17 men from 1978 to 1991. This case not only highlights the gruesome nature of a serial killer's mind, but also shows how our justice system isn't partial and depicts racial discrimination. Jeffrey targeted people from marginalized communities, including Asian, Indigenous, Black, and Latino men and boys, with 11 out of 17 of his victims being African American. Jeffrey Dahmer was born to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer on May 21, 1960. Their family was dysfunctional, with Lionel always being busy with work and Joyce dealing with severe mental health issues. Even when Joyce was having Jeffrey, she was on medication for anxiety and used to take heavy doses of medicine to stay normal. Her husband always discouraged her from taking medicines and never took her deteriorating mental health seriously. Apart from the familial abnormalities, Jeffrey was reported to be a happy child till he had to get surgery at the age of 4 to correct his double hernia. The recovery from the surgery was a traumatic and painful one, and it caused several negative changes in him. Adding fuel to the fire, his mother gave birth to his younger brother, David, and this led to Jeffrey's isolation from his own family. Additionally, the family also shifted continuously from one home to another, and by the time Jeffrey was of school age, they were residing in Ohio. Jeffrey, over time, developed a fascination for animal remains such as bones and skulls and used to collect them in jars of formaldehyde. His father was a chemist, and he often collected and dissected animal remains with Jeffrey, believing his own son was interested in animal anatomy. However, this activity later revealed a darker side, as Jeffrey became fixated on dead animals and dissection. Jeffrey developed a habit of drinking by the age of 14, and by the age of 18, he lost control and started overconsumption of alcohol. His parents' divorce also affected him to a certain level, since he was abandoned by his mother and left in the care of his father, who completely forgot about him. Jeffrey committed his first murder soon after finishing high school in 1978. He picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and brought him back to his parents' house. Jeffrey gave him alcohol, and when Hicks tried to leave, Jeffrey killed him by hitting him on the head and strangling him with a barbell. After the murder, Jeffrey cut up Hicks' body, put the parts in plastic bags, and buried them behind his parents' house. Later, he dug up the remains, crushed the bones, and scattered them in a nearby ravine. One thing about Jeffrey was that he made sure his victims belonged to the periphery, and it was the reason why he was not caught for the murders for nearly 13 years. After the first murder, Jeffrey stopped, or rather did not get a chance to do it, as he had dropped out of Ohio State University, and his recently remarried father convinced him to enlist in the Army in 1978. After being discharged from the Army in 1981, with an arrest due to disorderly conduct and overconsumption of alcohol, his father sent him to his grandmother's home. But nothing changed, as his violent tendencies continued to develop, which saddened his grandmother a lot. While at his grandmother's home, he used to work at a meat shop and enjoyed cutting the meat, as it sexually aroused him. Another job that he had apart from this was at the blood bank, where he would take out blood from people. But what made this job peculiar was that he would bring bottles of blood back home and drink it. Jeffrey was again arrested in 1986 for pleasuring himself in front of 2 young boys. This arrest resulted in him getting a 1-year probationary sentence. The second murder he committed was in September 1987, after Jeffrey took his second victim, Stephen Toomey. They checked into a hotel room and drank, and Jeffrey later woke up to find Toomey dead, with no memory of what happened the night before. He later told the police that he had only intended to drug Toomey, not kill him, and said, "I couldn't believe this happened." Jeffrey bought a large suitcase to move Toomey's body to his grandmother's basement, where he dismembered it, He admitted that he treated the corpse inappropriately before disposing of the remains, but kept Toomey's head for weeks. To a normal human surprise, Toomey's head was stored in a box where his grandmother kept pictures of Lionel's childhood. Keeping his head in the same box meant that the head was very dear to him, and he felt pleased looking at it. After Toomey's death, Jeffrey said his obsession with killing went into full swing, and he stopped trying to control it. He went on to kill 2 more victims at his grandmother's house before she made him move out in 1988. While she didn't know about his crimes, she was fed up with his drinking and bringing young men over, and the bad smells coming from the basement. Her basement was a place she would rarely visit, and according to some people, Jeffrey's grandmother knew that he was doing something shady in the basement, but did not look into the matter, probably because she was not ready to accept the reality. His grandmother, in his initial days at her home, also found a male mannequin in his room that he would use for physical pleasures, and threw it out. But Jeffrey told her that he had only kept it there for photography purposes. It was a tactic he used to lure his victims to his apartment in the later years, after being abandoned by his grandmother. He would tell them to accompany him to his house for modeling, and promise them a career in modeling if they accompanied him. Once they got inside his home, he would spike their drinks, then murder them. His series of murders continued after Toomey, and did not stop until the 17th murder. After Toomey, a 14-year-old boy, James Dockstader, became his victim. On January 19, 1987, Jeffrey met James at a bus stop and offered him money to come to his grandmother's house. There, he spiked his drink with sleeping pills, then raped his unconscious body, after which he brutally murdered him. He kept the body in his basement for about a week before dismembering it and dissolving the flesh in acid. On the other hand, he crushed his bones, made a powder of them, and scattered them into an empty plot. His 4th victim was a 25-year-old man, Richard Guerrero, whom he lured to his grandmother's house with an offer of $50 on March 24, 1988. He then drugged, strangled, and dismembered him. His remains were identified later through a family photograph. After Richard, Anthony Sears became his 5th victim. Anthony, who was a 26-year-old aspiring model, was murdered brutally by Jeffrey. Anthony was killed a year later, and many blamed Judge William Gardner for it. Gardner had allowed Jeffrey Dahmer to be on work release during his 1-year jail sentence for the 2nd-degree sexual assault of 13-year-old Somsak Sintasomphone, which happened just 2 months earlier. Jeffrey kept Anthony's genitalia and skull preserved in his apartment. After Anthony came Raymond Smith, also known as Ricky Beeks, who was Jeffrey's first victim in his Milwaukee apartment on May 20, 1990. Smith, a sex worker, was lured by the promise of $50 and strangled by Jeffrey. After strangling him, Jeffrey boiled him and dissolved his remains in acid, saving only the skull as a trophy. Eddie Smith, Jeffrey's next victim in June of 1990, met a similar fate. But unlike other victims, Eddie's remains were never found. Dahmer confessed to his murder later, and Eddie's sister received a haunting call in 1991, telling her not to look for her brother because he was dead. After Eddie, Ernest Miller became the next victim who met Jeffrey in September of 1990 during a visit to his aunt in Milwaukee. Jeffrey seduced him back to his apartment with promises of money and repeated the pattern by drugging Miller. Once unconscious, Jeffrey sliced his throat, kept his biceps in the freezer, and bleached his skeleton. However, Jeffrey was not limited to unmarried men and boys, since his next victim was a father named David C. Thomas, who met Jeffrey in September 1990 at the Grand Avenue Mall. Jeffrey lured him back to his apartment, where David met his brutal, untimely death. His next victim was Curtis Straughter, who was only 17 years old and waiting for a bus when Jeffrey offered him money in exchange for naked photos. After killing him, Jeffrey documented his dismemberment through photographs and kept his skull as a reminder. In April 1991, Jeffrey killed Errol Lindsay and drilled a hole in Lindsay's skull. then poured acid into it in an attempt to make Errol a zombie. His next victim was Anthony Tony Hughes, a deaf and mute man, murdered in May of 1991. Jeffrey convinced him to visit his apartment to model for him. He is one of the victims with whom the media has dramatized Jeffrey's relationship. However, in reality, his body was left on Jeffrey's floor for 3 days before being dismembered. Then came his 13th victim, Conorak Synthesumphone, an Asian boy who was just 14 years old and was the brother of a victim that Jeffrey had sexually assaulted and faced imprisonment for. Conorak was lobotomized by Jeffrey, but managed to escape once Dahmer went out to buy himself a beer. Jeffrey later confessed to the police that he had drilled a hole in Conorak's head and had injected hydrochloric acid inside it at the time of the escape. An injured Conorak was spotted by 2 African-American women in the street who called the police. However, Jeffrey convinced them that Conorak was his lover who had had too much to drink, and the police sent him back to Jeffrey. Jeffrey later murdered him, dismembered him, drilled holes in his skull, and kept it as a souvenir. His 14th victim was Matt Turner, a 20-year-old man who met Dahmer at a bus stop following Chicago's Pride Parade in June of 1991. He was drugged, strangled, and dismembered with his head and torso preserved in Jeffrey's apartment. Another one of his victims was Jeremiah Weinberger, 23 years old, who met Jeffrey in a Chicago bar. And after taking a bus to Milwaukee together, Weinberger was killed following an argument. Dahmer drilled a hole in his skull and poured boiling water into it before dismembering his body. His second to last victim was in July 1991. A father named Oliver Lacey, whom he drugged before murdering and later raped his dead body. He then dismembered him as well and preserved his head and heart to eat later. Lastly, there was Joseph Braidhoft, Jeffrey's 17th and last victim, who was murdered in July of 1991. He was a father of 3, and his head and torso were preserved in Dahmer's freezer when the police caught him. Joseph's death marked the end of Dahmer's killing spree, as the police arrested him a few days later. Jeffrey Dahmer was finally caught on July 22, 1991, after a man named Tracy Edwards escaped from his apartment in Milwaukee. Like most of his victims, Jeffrey had lured Edwards to his place by offering him money in exchange for taking photos. Once inside the apartment, Edwards quickly realized something was wrong because of the foul smell. Jeffrey reassured him that the smell was of rotten meat and brought him a drink. Being hypersensitive to his surroundings, Edward noticed that his drink was unusually bubbly and suspected it to be spiked. The situation started to escalate, but Edward kept his calm and only took a sip of his drink before putting it aside. Edward somehow managed to escape and found 2 police officers, Robert Roth and Rolf Mueller, in the street. Collecting his calm, Edwards explained his situation to the officers and led them to Jeffrey's apartment. When they entered the apartment, the foul smell shocked them, and they started searching his apartment. Officer Mueller soon came across the Polaroid pictures showing the bodies he had dismembered and led to his immediate arrest. Upon further investigation, they also found the acid drum in which he had kept some parts of his victims' bodies. Other than this, they discovered several human skulls, some of which were painted or preserved, and even complete skeletons. Other containers in the apartment had human body parts, some of them frozen, which indicated that Dahmer may have been eating his victims. Despite all this evidence, Dahmer stayed calm during the police's search of his apartment, and when they questioned him, he quickly admitted to killing 17 young men and boys over the course of more than 10 years. He also confessed to sexually abusing the dead bodies and eating some of them due to an uncontrollable need to dominate and keep control over his victims, even after they had died. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial started in January 1992, and he was charged with 17 murders, although one charge was later dropped because there wasn't enough evidence. His lawyer tried to argue that Dahmer was guilty but insane, claiming that his mental problems made it impossible for him to control his actions. The defense said that Dahmer's psychological issues, like his obsession with dead bodies, made it hard for him to separate right from wrong when he committed the murders. However, the prosecution argued that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, pointing out that he had planned his crimes carefully, knowing that they were wrong, and carried them out in a calculated way. The state argued that Dahmer lured, killed, and got rid of his victims in a way that showed that he was sane and responsible for his actions. After a 2-week trial, the jury rejected the claim that Dahmer was insane, and on February 17, 1992, they found him guilty of 15 of the 16 murders he committed in Wisconsin. Prior to that, he had already been found guilty of murder in Ohio. Dahmer was sentenced to 15 life terms, which added up to 957 years in prison without the chance of parole, since there was no concept of the death penalty in Wisconsin. Jeffrey's trial raised many questions, like, what if the police had heard the pleas of the black women on the street in the case of Conorak? He might have survived, and Jeffrey might have been caught earlier. When asked about their decision to return Conorak's Sintasamphone to Jeffrey Dahmer, the officers, John Balcherzak and Joseph Gabrich, defended their actions. Officer Balcherzak explained, "At the time, with the information we had, to this day I think we did the appropriate thing, the best that we could." He added that they responded to the situation in the way that they believed was right, and he wished they had had more evidence or information available at the time. Systematic racism played a significant role in it, as the police officers gave priority to Jeffrey's claims rather than the state of Conorak and the pleas of 2 black women. Jeffrey died after a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver, a convicted murderer who suffered from schizophrenia, murdered him in prison. Christopher told everyone that God made him do it. Our thoughts and prayers go out to each of the victims and their families, and we wish nothing of this sort ever happens to anyone.